The Art of War by Niccolò Machiavelli. Book 2, Part 3. I say to you, therefore, that it is more important than anything to have soldiers who know how to form themselves quickly, and it is necessary in holding them in these companies to train them thoroughly, and have them proceed bravely forward or backward, to pass through difficult places without disturbing the order. For the soldiers who know how to do this well are experienced soldiers, and although they may have never met the enemy face to face, they can be called seasoned soldiers. And, on the contrary, those who do not know how to maintain this order, even if they have been in 1,000 wars, ought always to be considered as new soldiers. This applies in forming them when they are marching in small files. But if they are formed and then become broken because of some accident that results either from the location or from the enemy, to reorganize themselves immediately is the important and difficult thing, in which much training and practice is needed, and in which the ancients placed much emphasis. It is necessary, therefore, to do two things. First, to have many countersigns in the company. The other, always to keep this arrangement, that the same infantry always remain in the same file. For instance, if one is commanded to be in the second file, he will afterwards always stay there, and not only in this same file, but in the same position in the file. It is to be observed, as I have said, how necessary are the great number of countersigns, so that, coming together with other companies, it may be reorganized by its own men. Secondly, that the constable and centurion have tufts of feathers on their headdress, different and recognizable, and, what is more important, to arrange that the heads of 10 be recognized. To which the ancients paid very much attention, that nothing else would do but that they wrote numbers on their bucklers, calling then the first, second, third, fourth, etc. And they were not above content with this, but each soldier had to write on his shield the number of his file, and the number of his place assigned him in that file. The men, therefore, being thus countersigned, and accustomed to stay within these limits, if they should be disorganized, it is easy to reorganize them all quickly. For the flag staying fixed, the centurions and heads of 10 can judge their place by eye, and bring the left from the right, or the right from the left, with the usual distance between. The infantry, guided by their rules and by the difference in countersigns, can quickly take their proper places, just as if you were the staves of a barrel which you had first countersigned. I would wager you would put the barrel back together with great ease. But if you had not countersigned the staves, it is impossible to reassemble the barrel. This system, with diligence and practice, can be taught quickly, and can be quickly learned, and once learned, are forgotten with difficulty. For new men are guided by the old, and in time a province which has such training would become entirely expert in war. It is also necessary to teach them to turn in step, and do so when he should turn from the flanks and by the shoulders to the front, or from the front to the flanks or shoulders. This is very easy, for it is sufficient only that each man turn his body towards the side he is commanded to, and the direction in which they are turned becomes the front. It is true that when they turn by the flank, the ranks which turn go outside their usual area, because there is a small space between the breast to the shoulder, while from one flank to the other there is much space, which is all contrary to the regular formation of the company. Hence care should be used in employing it. But this is more important, and where more practice is needed, is when a company wants to turn entirely, as if it was a solid body. Here great care and practice must be employed, for if it is desired to turn to the left, for instance, it is necessary that the left wing be halted, and those who are closer to the halted one march much slower than those who are on the right wing, and have to run. Otherwise everything would be in confusion. But, as it always happens when an army marches from place to place, that the companies not situated in front, not having to combat at the front, or at the flanks or shoulders, have to move from the flank or shoulder quickly to the front. and when such companies, in such cases, have the space necessary as we indicated above, it is necessary that the pikemen they have on that flank become the front, and the heads of 10 centurions and constables belonging to it relocate to their proper places. Therefore, in wanting to do this, when forming them it is necessary to arrange the 80 files of 5 per file, placing all the pikemen in the first 20 files, and placing 5 of the heads of 10 in front of them, and 5 in the rear. The other 60 files situated behind are all shield-bearers, who total to 300. It should therefore be so arranged that the first and last file of every 100 are heads of 10. The constable with his flag and bugler be in the middle of the first 100 of shield-bearers, and the centurions at the head of every century. Thus arranged, when you want the pikemen to be on the left flank, you have to double them century by century from the right flank. If you want them to be on the right flank, you have to double them from the left. And thus the company turns, with the pikemen on the flank, with the heads of 10 on the front and rear, with the centurions at the front of them, and the constable in the middle. Which formation holds when going forward. But when the enemy comes, and the time for the companies to move from the flanks to the front, it cannot be done unless all the soldiers face towards the flank where the pikemen are, and then the company is turned, with its files and heads, in that manner that was described above. For the centurions being on the outside, and all the men in their places, the centurions quickly enter the ranks without difficulty. But when they are marching frontwards, and have to combat in the rear, they must arrange the files so that, in forming the company, the pikes are situated in the rear. And to do this, no other order has to be maintained, except that where, in the formation of the company ordinarily, every century has 5 files of pikemen in front, it now has them behind. But in all other parts, observe the order that I have mentioned. Cosimo said, "You have said, if I remember well, that this method of training is to enable them to form these companies into an army, and that this training serves to enable them to be arranged within it. But if it should occur that these 450 infantry have to operate as a separate party, how would you arrange them?" Fabrizio said, "I will now guide you in judging where he wants to place the pikes, and who should carry them, which is not in any way contrary to the arrangement mentioned above. For although it may be the method that is observed when, together with other companies, it comes to an engagement, none the less it is a rule that serves for all those methods in which it should happen that you have to manage it. But in showing you the other 2 methods for arranging the companies proposed by me, I will also better satisfy your question, for either they are never used, or they are used when the company is alone, and not in the company of others. And to come to the method of forming it with 2 horns or wings, I say that you ought to arrange the 80 files at 5 per file in this way. Place a centurion in the middle, and behind him 25 files that have 2 pikemen each on the left side, and 3 shield-bearers on the right. And after the first 5, in the next 20 heads of 10 be placed, all between the pikemen and shield-bearers, except that those heads who carry pikes stay with the pikemen. Behind these 25 files thusly arranged, another centurion is placed, who has 15 files of shield-bearers behind him. After these, the constable between the flag and the bugler, who also has behind him another 15 files of shield-bearers. The third centurion is placed behind these, and he has 25 files behind him, in each of which are 3 shield-bearers on the left side, and 2 pikemen on the right. And after the first 5 files are 20 heads of 10 placed between the pikemen and the shield-bearers. After these files there is the 4th centurion. If it is desired, therefore, to arrange these files to form a company with 2 horns or wings, the 1st centurion has to be halted with the 25 files which are behind him. The 2nd centurion then has to be moved with the 15 shield-bearers who are on his rear, and turning to the right, and on the right flank of the 25 files, to proceed so far that he comes to the 15 files, and here he halts. After, the constable has to be moved with the 15 files of shield-bearers who are behind, and turning towards the right, over by the right flank of the 15 files which were moved first, marches so that he comes to their front, and here he halts. After, move the 3rd centurion with the 25 files and with the 4th centurion who is behind them, and turning to the right, march by the left flank of the last 15 files of shield-bearers, and he does not halt until he is at the head of them, but continues marching up until the last files of 25 are in line with the files behind. And having done this, the centurion who was the head of the first 15 files of shield-bearers leaves the place where he was, and goes to the hour of the left angle. And thus he will turn a company of 25 solid files, of 20 infantry per file, with 2 wings on each side of his front, and there will remain a space between them, as much as would be occupied by 10 men side by side. The captain will be between the 2 wings, and a centurion in each corner of the wing. There will be 2 files of pikemen, and 20 heads of 10 on each flank. These 2 wings serve to hold between them the artillery, whenever the company has any with it, and the carriages. The veleti have to stay along the flanks beneath the pikemen. But in wanting to bring this wing-formed company into the form of a piazza or plaza, nothing else need be done than to take 8 of the 15 files of 20 per file, and place them between the points of the 2 horns or wings, which then from wings become the rear shoulder of the piazza or plaza. The carriages are kept in this plaza, and the captain and the flag there, but not the artillery, which is put either in the front or along the flanks. These are the methods which can be used by a company when it has to pass by suspicious places by itself. None the less, the solid company, without wings and without the plaza, is best. But in wanting to make safe the disarmed ones, the winged one is necessary. The Swiss also have many forms of companies, among which they form one into the manner of a cross, as in the spaces between the arms they keep their gunners safe from the attacks of the enemy. But since such companies are good in fighting by themselves, and my intention is to show how several companies united together combat with the enemy, I do not belabor myself further in describing it. Cosimo said, "And it appears to me I have very well comprehended the method that ought to be employed in training the men in these companies. But, if I remember well, you said that in addition to the 10 companies in a battalion, you would add 1,000 extraordinary pikemen and 400 extraordinary veleti. Would you not describe how to train these?" Fabrizio said, "I would, and with the greatest diligence. And I would train the pikemen group by group, at least in the formation of the companies, as the others. For I would serve myself of these more than of the ordinary companies in all the particular actions, how to escort, to raid, and such things. But the veleti I would train at home, without bringing them together with the others. For, as it is their office to combat brokenly, in the open or separately, it is not as necessary that they come together with the others, or to train in common exercises, than to train them well in particular exercises. They ought, therefore, as was said in the beginning, and now it appears to me laborious to repeat it, to train their own men in these companies, so that they know how to maintain their ranks, know their places, return there quickly when either the evening or the location disrupts them. For when this is caused to be done, they can easily be taught the place the company has to hold, and what its office should be in the armies. And if a prince or a republic works hard and puts diligence in these formations and in this training, it will always happen that there will be good soldiers in that country, and they will be superior to their neighbours, and will be those who give and not receive laws from other men. But, as I have told you, the disorder in which one exists causes them to disregard and not to esteem these things, and therefore our training is not good. And even if there should be some heads or members naturally of virtue, they are unable to demonstrate it." Cosimo said, "What carriages would you want each of these companies to have?" Fabrizio said, "The first thing I would want is that the centurions or the heads of 10 should not go on horseback, and if the constables want to ride mounted, I would want them to have a mule, and not a horse. I would permit them 2 carriages, and 1 to each centurion, and 2 to every 3 heads of 10, for they would quarter so many in each encampment, as we will narrate in its proper place, so that each company would have 36 carriages, which I would have to carry the necessary tents, cooking utensils, hatchets, digging bars, sufficient to make the encampment, and after that anything else of convenience. Cosimo said, I believe that heads assigned by you in each of the companies are necessary. None the less, I would be apprehensive that so many commanders would be confusing. Fabrizio said, they would be so if I would refer to one, but as I refer to many, they make for order. And actually, without those orders, it would be impossible to control them, for a wall which inclines on every side would need many and frequent supports, even if they are not so strong. But if few, they must be strong. For the virtue of only one, despite its spacing, can remedy any ruin. And so it must be that in the armies, and among every 10 men, there is one of more life, more heart, or at least more authority, who with his courage with words and by example keeps the others firm and disposed to fight. And these things mentioned by me, as the heads, the flags, the buglers, are necessary in an army, and it is seen that we have all these in our present-day armies, but no one does his duty. First, the heads of 10, in desiring that those things be done because they are ordered, it is necessary, as I have said, for each of them to have his men separate, lodge with them, go into action with them, stay in the ranks with them. For when they are in their proper places, they are all of mind and temperament to maintain the ranks straight and firm, and it is impossible for them to become disrupted, or if they become disrupted, do not quickly reform their ranks. But today they do not serve us for anything other than to give them more pay than the others, and to have them do some particular thing. The same happens with the flags, for they are kept rather to make a beautiful show than for any military use. But the ancients served themselves of it as a guide and to reorganize themselves, for everyone, when the flag was standing firm, knew the place he had to be near his flag, and always returned there. He also knew that if it were moving or standing still, he had to move or halt. It is necessary in an army, therefore, that there be many bodies, and that each body have its own flag and its own guide, for if they have this, it needs must be that they have much courage, and consequently are livelier. The infantry, therefore, ought to march according to the flag, and the flag move according to the bugle call, which call, if given well, commands the army, which, proceeding in step with those, comes to serve the orders easily. Whence the ancients, having whistles, pipes, fifes, and bugles, controlled them perfectly. For as he who dances proceeds in time with the music, and keeping with it does not make a misstep, so an army obedient in its movement to that call will not become disorganized. And therefore they varied the calls according as they wanted to enkindle or quiet or firm the spirits of men. And as the sounds were various, so they named them variously. The Doric call brought on constancy, frigio, fury or boldness. Whence they tell that Alexander, being at table, and someone sounding the frigio call, it so excited his spirit that he took up arms. It would be necessary to rediscover all these methods, and if this is difficult, it ought not at least to be totally put aside by those who teach the soldiers to obey, which each one can vary and arrange in his own way, so long as with practice he accustoms the ears of his soldiers to recognize them. But today no benefit is gotten from these sounds in great part other than to make noise. Cosimo said, I would desire to learn from you, if you have ever pondered this with yourself, whence such baseness and disorganization arises, and such negligence of this training in our times. Fabrizio said, I will tell you willingly what I think. You know, of the men excellent in war, there have been many famed in Europe, few in Africa, and less in Asia. This results from the fact that these last 2 parts of the world have had a principality or two, and few republics, But Europe alone has had some kingdoms and an infinite number of republics. And men become excellent and show their virtue according as they are employed and recognized by their prince, republic, or king, whichever it may be. It happens, therefore, that where there is much power, many valiant men spring up; where there is little, few. In Asia there are found Ninus, Cyrus, Artaphersus, Mithridates, and very few others to accompany these. In Africa there are noted, omitting those of ancient Egypt, Maximinus, Jugurtha, and those captains who are raised by the Carthaginian Republic, and these are very few compared to those of Europe. For in Europe there are excellent men without number, and there would be many more, if there should be named together with them those others who have been forgotten by the malignity of the time, since the world has been more virtuous when there have been many states which have favoured virtue, either from necessity or from other human passion. Few men, therefore, spring up in Asia, because as that province was entirely subject to one kingdom, in which, because of its greatness, there was indolence for the most part, it could not give rise to excellent men in activity. The same happened in Africa. Yet several, with respect to the Carthaginian Republic, did arise. More excellent men come out of republics than from kingdoms, because in the former virtue is honoured much of the time, in the kingdom it is feared. Whence it results that in the former men of virtue are raised, in the latter they are extinguished. Whoever, therefore, considers the part of Europe will find it to have been full of republics and principalities, which, from the fear one had of the other, were constrained to keep alive their military organizations, and honour those who greatly prevailed in them. For in Greece, in addition to the kingdoms of the Macedonians, there were many republics, and many most excellent men arose in each of them. In Italy there were the Romans, the Samnites, the Tuscans, the Cisalpine Gauls. France and Germany were full of republics and princes. Spain the very same. And although in comparison with the Romans very few others were noted, it resulted from the malignity of the writers, who pursued fortune, and to whom it was often enough to honour the victors. For it is not reasonable that among the Samnites and Tuscans, who fought 50 years with the Roman people before they were defeated, many excellent men should not have sprung up. And so likewise in France and Spain. But that virtue which the writers do not commemorate in particular men, they commemorate generally in the peoples, in which they exalt to the stars the obstinacy which existed in them in defending their liberty. It is true, therefore, that where there are many empires, more valiant men spring up, and it follows of necessity that those being extinguished, little by little virtue is extinguished, as there is less reason which causes men to become virtuous. And as the Roman Empire afterwards kept growing, and having extinguished all the republics and principalities of Europe and Africa, and in greater part those of Asia, no other path to virtue was left except Rome. Whence it resulted that men of virtue began to be few in Europe as in Asia, which virtue ultimately came to decline. For all the virtue being brought to Rome, and as it was corrupted, so almost the whole world came to be corrupted, and the Scythian people were able to come to plunder that empire, which had extinguished the virtue of others, but did not know how to maintain its own. And although afterwards that empire, because of the inundation of those barbarians, became divided into several parts, this virtue was not renewed. First, because a price is paid to recover institutions when they are spoiled; another, because the mode of living today, with regard to the Christian religion, does not impose that necessity to defend it that anciently existed, in which, at the time, men defeated in war were either put to death or remained slaves in perpetuity, where they led lives of misery. The conquered lands were either desolated or the inhabitants driven out, their goods taken away, and they were sent dispersed throughout the world, so that those overcome in war suffered every last misery. Men were terrified from the fear of this, and they kept their military exercises alive, and honoured those who were excellent in them. But today this fear in large part is lost, and few of the defeated are put to death, and no one is kept prisoner long, for they are easily liberated. The citizens, although they should rebel 1,000 times, are not destroyed. Goods are left to their people, so that the greatest evil that is feared is a ransom, so that men do not want to subject themselves to dangers which they little fear. Afterwards, these provinces of Europe exist under very few heads as compared to the past, for all of France obeys a king, all of Spain another, and Italy exists in a few parts, so that weak cities defend themselves by allying themselves with the victors, and strong states, for the reasons mentioned, do not fear an ultimate ruin. Cosimo said, "And in the last 25 years many towns have been seen to be pillaged and lost their kingdoms, which examples ought to teach others to live and reassume some of the ancient orders." Fabrizio said, "That is what you say, but if you would note which towns are pillaged, you would not find them to be the chief ones of the state, but only members, as is seen in the sacking of Tortona and not Milan, Capua and not Naples, Brescia and not Venice, Ravenna and not Rome; which examples do not cause the present thinking which governs to change. Rather, it causes them to remain in that opinion of being able to recover themselves by ransom. And because of this, they do not want to subject themselves to the bother of military training, as it appears to them partly unnecessary, partly a tangle they do not understand. Those others who are slave, to whom such examples ought to cause fear, do not have the power of remedying their situation, and those princes who have lost the state are no longer in time, and those who have the state do not have military training or want it, for they want, without any hardship, to remain in power through fortune, not through their own virtue, and who see that, because there is so little virtue, fortune governs everything, and they want it to master them, not they master it. And that which I have discussed is true, consider Germany, in which, because there are many principalities and republics, there is much virtue, and all that is good in our present army depends on the example of those people, who, being completely jealous of their state, as they fear servitude which elsewhere is not feared, maintain and honour themselves all as lords. I want this to suffice to have said in showing the reasons for the present business according to my opinion. I do not know if it appears the same to you, or if some other apprehension should have arisen from this discussion." Cosimo said, "None. Rather, I am most satisfied with everything. I desire above, returning to our principal subject, to learn from you how you would arrange the cavalry with these companies, and how many, how captained, and how armed." Fabrizio said, "And it, perhaps, appears to you that I have omitted these, at which do not be surprised, for I speak little of them for two reasons. One, because this part of the army is less corrupt than that of the infantry, for it is not stronger than the ancient, it is on a par with it. However, a short while before, the method of training them has been mentioned, and as to arming them, I would arm them as is presently done, both as to the light cavalry as to the men-at-arms. But I would want the light cavalry to be all archers, with some light gunners among them, who, although of little use in other actions of war, are most useful in terrifying the peasants, and place them above a pass that is to be guarded by them, for one gunner causes more fear to the enemy than 20 other armed men. And as to numbers, I say that, departing from imitating the Roman army, I would have not less than 300 effective cavalry for each battalion, of which I would want 150 to be men-at-arms, and 150 light cavalry. And I would give a leader to each of these parts, creating among them 15 heads of 10 per hand, and give each one a flag and a bugler. I would want that every 10 men-at-arms to have 5 carriages, and every 10 light cavalrymen 2, which, like those of the infantry, should carry the tents, cooking utensils, hitches, poles, and, in addition over the others, their tools. And do not think this is out of place, seeing that men-at-arms have 4 horses at their service, and that such a practice is a corrupting one. For in Germany it is seen that those men-at-arms are alone with their horses, and only every 20 have a cart which carries the necessary things behind them. The horsemen of the Romans were likewise alone. It is true that the triarii encamped near the cavalry, and were obliged to render aid to it in the handling of the horses. This can easily be imitated by us, as will be shown in the distribution of quarters. That, therefore, which the Romans did, and that which the Germans do, we also can do. And in not doing it, we make a mistake. These cavalrymen, enrolled and organized together with a battalion, can often be assembled when the companies are assembled, and caused to make some semblance of attack among them, which should be done more so that they be recognized among them than for any necessity. But I have said enough on this subject for now, and let us descend to forming an army which is able to offer battle to the enemy and hope to win it, which is the end for which an army is organized, and so much study put into it. End of Book 2. Book 3, Part 1 of The Art of War. Cosimo said, "Since we are changing the discussion, I would like the questioner to be changed, so that I may not be held to be presumptuous, which I have always censured in others. I therefore resign the speakership, and I surrender it to any of these friends of mine who want it." Zenobie said, "It would be most gracious of you to continue, but since you do not want to, you ought at least to tell us which of us should succeed in your place." Cosimo said, "I would like to pass this burden on to the Lord Fabrizio." Fabrizio said, "I am content to accept it, and would like to follow the Venetian custom, that the youngest talks first. For this being an exercise for young men, I am persuaded that young men are more adept at reasoning than they are quick to follow." Cosimo said, "It falls therefore to you, Luigi, and I am pleased with such a successor, as long as you are satisfied with such a questioner." Fabrizio said, "I am certain that in wanting to show how an army is well organized for undertaking an engagement, it would be necessary to narrate how the Greeks and the Romans arranged the ranks in their armies. None the less, as you yourselves are able to read and consider these things through the medium of ancient writers, I shall omit many particulars, and will cite only those things that appear necessary for me to imitate in the desire, in our times, to give some part of perfection to our army. This will be done, and in time I will show how an army is arranged for an engagement, how it faces a real battle, and how it can be trained in mock ones. The greatest mistake that those men make who arrange an army for an engagement is to give it only one front, and commit it to only one onrush and one attempt or fortune. This results from having lost the method the ancients employed of receiving one rank into the other. For without this method one cannot help the rank in front, or defend them, or change them by rotation in battle, which was practised best by the Romans. In explaining this method, therefore, I want to tell how the Romans divided each legion into 3 parts, namely the Astati, the Princeps, and the Triarii, of whom the Astati were placed in the first line of the army in solid and deep ranks, and behind them were the Princeps, but placed with their ranks more open, and behind these they placed the Triarii, with ranks so sparse as to be able, if necessary, to receive the Princeps and the Astati between them. In addition to these they had slingers, bowmen, archers, and other lightly armed, who were not in these ranks, but were situated at the head of the army, between the cavalry and the infantry. These light-armed men, therefore, enkindled the battle, and if they won, which rarely happened, they pursued the victory. If they were repulsed, they retired by way of the flanks of the army, or into the intervals and gaps provided for such a result, and were led back among those who were not armed. After this proceeding, the Astati came hand to hand with the enemy, and who, if they saw themselves being overcome, retired little by little through the open spaces in the ranks of the Princeps, and together with them renewed the fight. If these also were forced back, they all retired into the thin lines of the Triarii, and all together, en masse, recommenced the battle. And if these were defeated, there was no other remedy, as there was no way left to reform themselves. The cavalry were on the flanks of the army, placed like 2 wings on a body, and they sometimes fought on horseback and sometimes helped the infantry, according as the need required. This method of reforming themselves 3 times is almost impossible to surpass, as it is necessary that fortune abandon you 3 times, and that the enemy has so much virtue that he overcomes you 3 times. The Greeks, with their phalanxes, did not have this method of reforming themselves, and although these had many ranks and leaders within them, none the less they constituted one body, or rather one front, so that in order to help one another they did not retire from one rank into the other, as the Romans, but one man took the place of another, which they did in this way. Their phalanxes were made up of ranks, and supposing they had placed 50 men per rank, when their front came up against the enemy, only the first 6 ranks of all of them were able to fight, because their lances, which they called sarisi, were so long that the point of the lances of those in the 6th rank reached past the front rank. When they fought, therefore, if any of the first rank fell, either killed or wounded, whoever was behind him in the 2nd rank immediately entered into his place, and whoever was behind him in the 3rd rank immediately entered into the place of the 2nd rank, which became vacant, and thus successively all at once the ranks behind restored the deficiencies of those in front, so that the ranks were always remained complete, and no position of the combatants was vacant except in the last rank, which became depleted because there was no one in its rear to restore it, so that the injuries which the first rank suffered depleted the last, and the first rank always remained complete. And thus the phalanxes, because of this arrangement, were able rather to become depleted than broken, since the large size of its body made it more immobile. The Romans, in the beginning, also employed phalanxes, and it struck their legions in a way similar to theirs. Afterwards they were not satisfied with this arrangement, and divided the legion into several bodies, that is, into cohorts and maniples, for they judged, as was said a little while ago, that that body should have more life in it, be more active, which should have more spirit, and that it should be composed of several parts, and each regulate itself. The battalions of the Swiss, in these times, employed all the methods of the phalanxes, as much in the size and entirety of their organization as in the method of helping one another, and when coming to an engagement they placed the battalions one on the flank of the other, or they placed them one behind the other. They have no way in which the first rank, if it should retire, to be received by the second, but with this arrangement, in order to help one another, they place one battalion in front and another behind it, to the right, so that if the first has need of aid, the latter can go forward and succour it. They put a 3rd battalion behind these, but distant a gunshot. This they do because if the other 2 are repulsed, this 3rd one can make its way forward, and the others have room in which to retire, and avoid the onrush of the one which is going forward. For a large multitude cannot be received in the same way as a small body, and therefore the small and separate bodies that existed in a Roman legion could be so placed together as to be able to receive one another among themselves, and help each other easily. And that this arrangement of the Swiss is not as good as that of the ancient Romans is demonstrated by the many examples of the Roman legions when they engaged in battle with the Greek phalanxes, and the latter were always destroyed by the former, because the kinds of arms, as I mentioned before, and this method of reforming themselves was not able to maintain the solidity of the phalanx. With these examples, therefore, if I had to organize an army, I would prefer to retain the arms and the methods partly of the Greek phalanxes, partly of the Roman legions. And therefore I have mentioned wanting in a battalion 2,000 pikes, which are the arms of the Macedonian phalanxes, and 3,000 swords and shield, which are the arms of the Romans. I have divided the battalion into 10 companies, as the Romans divided the legion into 10 cohorts. I have organized the veliti, that is, the light-armed, to enkindle the battle, as they, the Romans, did. And thus, as the arms are mixed, being shared by both nations, and as also the organizations are shared, I have arranged that each company have 5 ranks of pikes in front, and the remainder swordsmen with shields, in order to be able with this front to resist the cavalry and easily penetrate the enemy companies on foot, and the enemy at first encounter would meet the pikes, which I would hope would suffice to resist him, and then the swordsman would defeat him. And if you would note the virtue of this arrangement, you will see all these arms will execute their office completely. First, because pikes are useful against cavalry, and when they come against infantry, they do their duty well before the battle closes in, for when they are pressed, they become useless. Whence the Swiss, to avoid this disadvantage, after every 3 ranks of pikemen, place one of halberds, which, while it is not enough, gives the pikemen room to manoeuvre. Placing, therefore, our pikes in the front, and the shields and swordsmen behind, they manage to resist the cavalry, and, in enkindling the battle, lay open and attack the infantry. But when the battle closes in, and they become useless, the shields and swords take their place, who are able to take care of themselves in every strait.
Luigi said, "We now await with desire to learn how you would arrange an army for battle with these arms and with these organizations." Fabrizio said, "I do not want to show you anything else other than this. You have to understand that in a regular Roman army, which they called a consular army, there were not more than 2 legions of Roman citizens, which consist of 600 cavalrymen, about 11,000 infantry. They also had as many more infantry and cavalry, which were sent to them by their friends and confederates, which they divided into 2 parts, and they called one the right wing, and the other the left wing, and they never permitted these latter infantry to exceed the number of infantry of the legion. They were well content that the cavalry should be greater in number. With this army, which consisted of 22,000 infantry and about 2,000 cavalry effectives, a consul undertook every action and went on every enterprise. And when it was necessary to face a large force, they brought together 2 consuls with 2 armies. You ought also to note that ordinarily in all 3 of the principal activities in which armies engage, that is, marching, camping, and fighting, they placed the legion in the middle, because they wanted that virtue in which they should trust most should be a greater unity, as the discussion of all these activities will show you. Those auxiliary infantry, because of the training they had with the infantry of the legion, were as effective as the latter, as they were disciplined as they were, and therefore they arranged them in a similar way when organizing for an engagement. Whoever, therefore, knows how they deployed the entire army. Therefore, having told you how they divided a legion into 3 lines, and how one line would receive the others, I have come to tell you how the entire army was organized for an engagement. If I would want, therefore, to arrange an army for an engagement in imitation of the Romans, just as they had 2 legions, I would take 2 battalions. And these having been deployed, the disposition of an entire army would be known. For by adding more people, nothing else is accomplished than to enlarge the organization. I do not believe it is necessary that I remind you how many infantry there are in a battalion, and that it has 10 companies, and what leaders there are per company, and what arms they have, and who are the ordinary or regular pikemen and veliti, and who the extraordinary, because a little while ago I distinctly told you, and I reminded you to commit it to memory as something necessary if you want to understand all the other arrangements. And therefore I will come to the demonstration of the arrangement, without repeating these again. And it appears to me that 10 companies of a battalion should be placed on the left flank, and the 10 others on the right. Those on the left should be arranged in this way. The 5 companies should be placed one alongside the other on the front, so that between one and the next there should be a space of 4 arm lengths, which come to occupy an area of 140 arm lengths long and 40 wide. Behind these 5 companies I would place 3 others, distant in a straight line from the first ones by 40 arm lengths, 2 of which should come behind in a straight line at the ends of the 5, and the other should occupy the space in the middle. Thus these 3 would come to occupy in length and width the same space as the 5, but where the 5 would have a distance of 4 arm lengths between one another, this one would have 33. Behind these I would place the last 2 companies, also in a straight line behind the 3, and distant from those 3 40 arm lengths, and I would place each of them behind the ends of the 3, so that the space between them would be 91 arm lengths. All of these companies arranged thusly would therefore cover an area of 141 arm lengths long and 200 wide.
The extraordinary pikemen I would extend along the flanks of these companies on the left side, distant 20 arm lengths from it, creating 143 files of 7 per file, so that they should cover the entire length of the 10 companies arranged as I have previously described. And there would remain 40 files for protecting the wagons and the unarmed people in the tail of the army, and assigning the heads of 10 and the centurions in their proper places. And of the 3 constables I would put one at the head, another in the middle, and the third in the last file, who should fill the office of tergidatori, as the ancients called the one placed in the charge of the rear of the army. But returning to the head or van of the army, I say that I would place the extraordinary veliti alongside the extraordinary pikemen, which, as you know, are 500, and would place them at a distance of 40 arm lengths. On the side of these, also on the left hand, I would place the men-at-arms, and would assign them a distance of 150 arm lengths away. Behind these the light cavalry, to whom I would assign the same space as the men-at-arms. The ordinary veliti I would leave around their companies, who would occupy those spaces which I placed between one company and another, and would act to minister to those companies, unless I had already placed them under the extraordinary pikemen, which I would do or not do according as it should benefit my plans. The general head of all the battalions I would place in that space that exists between the first and second order of companies, or rather at the head, and in that space which exists between the last of the first 5 companies and the extraordinary pikemen, according as it should benefit my plans, surrounded by 30 or 60 picked men, and who should know how to execute a commission prudently and stalwartly resist an attack, and should also be in the middle of the buglers and flag carriers. This is the order in which I would deploy a battalion on the left side, which would be the deployment of half the army, and would cover an area 511 arm lengths long, and as much as mentioned above in width, not including the space which that part of the extraordinary pikemen should occupy, who act as a shield for the unarmed men, which would be about 100 arm lengths. The other battalions I would deploy on the right side, exactly in the same way as I deployed those on the left, having a space of 30 arm lengths between one battalion and the other, in the head of which space I would place some artillery pieces, behind which would be the captain general of the entire army, who should have around him, in addition to the buglers and flag carriers, at least 200 picked men, the greater portion on foot, among whom should be 10 or more adept at executing every command, and should be so provided with arms and a horse as to be able to go on horseback or afoot as the need requires. 10 cannon of the artillery of the army suffice for the reduction of towns, which should not exceed 50 pounds per charge, of which in the field I would employ more in the defence of the encampment than in waging a battle, and the other artillery should all be rather often than 15 pounds of charge. This I would place in front of the entire army, unless the country should be such that I could situate it on the flank in a safe place, where it should not be able to be attacked by the enemy. This formation of the army, thusly arranged, in combat can maintain the order both of the phalanxes and of the Roman legions, because the pikemen are in front, and all the infantry so arranged in ranks that, coming to battle with the enemy and resisting him, they should be able to reform the first ranks from those behind, according to the usage of the phalanxes. On the other hand, if they are attacked so that they are compelled to break ranks and retire, they can enter into the space of the second company behind them, and uniting with them, and en masse be able to resist the combat of the enemy again. And if this should not be enough, they can in the same way retire a second time, and combat a third time, so that in this arrangement, as to combating, they can reform according to both the Greek method and the Roman. As to the strength of the army, it cannot be arranged any stronger, for both wings are amply provided with both leaders and arms, and no part is left weak, except that part behind which is unarmed, and even that part has its flanks protected by the extraordinary pikemen. Nor can the enemy assault it in any part where he will not find them organized, and the part in the back cannot be assaulted because there cannot be an enemy who has so much power that he can assail every side equally. For if there is one, you don't have to take the field with him. But if he should be a third greater than you, and as well organized as you, if he weakens himself by assaulting you in several places, as soon as you defeat one part, all will go badly for him. If his cavalry should be greater than yours, be most assured, for the ranks of pikemen that gird you will defend you from every onrush of theirs, even if your cavalry should be repulsed. In addition to this, the heads are placed on the side, so that they are able easily to command and obey. And the spaces that exist between one company and the next one, and between one rank and the next, not only serve to enable one to receive the other, but also to provide a place for the messengers who go and come by order of the captain. And as I told you before, as the Romans had about 20,000 men in an army, so too ought this one have. And as other soldiers borrowed their mode of fighting and the formation of their army from the legions, so too those soldiers that you assembled into your 2 battalions would have to borrow their formations and organization. Having given example of these things, it is an easy matter to imitate it, for if the army is increased either by 2 battalions or by as many men as are contained in them, nothing else has to be done than to double the arrangements, and where 10 companies are placed on the left side, 20 are now placed, either by increasing or extending the ranks, according as the place or the enemy should command you. Luigi said, "Truly, my lord, I have so imagined this army that I see it now, and have a desire to see it facing us, and not for anything in the world would I desire you to become Fabius Maximus, having thoughts of holding the enemy at bay and delaying the engagement, for I would say worse of you than the Roman people said of him." Fabrizio said, "Do not be apprehensive. Do you not hear the artillery? Ours has already fired, but harmed the enemy little. And the extraordinary veleti come forth from their places, together with the light cavalry, and spread out, and with as much fury and the loudest shouts of which they are capable, assault the enemy, whose artillery has fired one time, and has passed over the heads of our infantry without doing them any injury. And as it is not able to fire a second time, our veleti and cavalry has already seized it, and to defend it the enemy has moved forward, so that neither that of friend or enemy can perform its office. You see with what virtue our men fight, and with what discipline they have become accustomed because of the training they have had, and from the confidence they have in the army, which you see with their stride, and with the men-at-arms alongside, in marching order, going to rekindle the battle with the adversary. You see our artillery, which, to make place for them and to leave the space free, has retired to the place from which the veleti went forth. You see the captain, who encourages them and points out to them certain victory. You see the veleti and light cavalry have spread out and returned to the flanks of the army, in order to see if they can cause any injury to the enemy on the flanks. Look, the armies are facing each other. Watch with what virtue they have withstood the onrush of the enemy, and with what silence, and how the captain commands the men-at-arms that they should resist and not attack, and do not detach themselves from the ranks of the infantry. You see how our light cavalry has gone to attack a band of enemy gunners who wanted to attack by the flank, and how the enemy cavalry have succoured them, so that, caught between the cavalry of the one and the other, they cannot fire, and retire behind their companies. You see with what fury our pikemen attack them, and how the infantry is already so near each other that they can no longer manage their pikes, so that according to the discipline taught by us, our pikemen retire little by little among the shields. Watch how in this encounter so great an enemy band of men-at-arms has pushed back our men-at-arms on the left side, and how ours, according to discipline, have retired under the extraordinary pikemen, and having reformed the front with their aid, have repulsed the adversary and killed a good part of them. In fact, all the ordinary pikemen of the first company have hidden themselves among the ranks of the shields, and having left the battle to the swordsman, who, look with what virtue, security, and leisure, kill the enemy. Do you not see that, when fighting, the ranks are so straitened that they can handle the swords only with much effort? Look with what hurry the enemy moves, for armed with the pike and their swords useless, the one because it is too long, the other because of finding the enemy too greatly armed, in part they fall dead or wounded, in part they flee. See them flee on the right side, they also flee on the left. Look, the victory is ours. Have we not won an engagement very happily? But it would have been won with greater felicity if I should have been allowed to put them in action. And see that it was not necessary to avail ourselves of either the second or third ranks, that our first line was sufficient to overcome them. In this part I have nothing else to tell you, except to dissolve any doubt that should arise in you." Luigi said, "You have won this engagement with so much fury that I am astonished, and in fact so stupefied that I do not believe I can well explain if there is any doubt left in my mind. Yet, trusting in your prudence, I will take courage to say that I intend. Tell me first, why did you not let your artillery fire more than one time? And why did you have them quickly retire within the army, not afterward make any other mention of them? It seems to me also that you pointed the enemy artillery high, and arranged it so that it should be of much benefit to you. Yet if it should occur, and I believe it happens often, that the lines are pierced, what remedy do you provide? And since I have commenced on artillery, I want to bring up all these questions so as not to have to discuss it any more. I have heard many disparage the arms and the organization of the ancient armies, arguing that today they could do little, or rather how useless they would be against the fury of artillery, for these are superior to their arms and break the ranks, so that it appears to them to be madness to create an arrangement that cannot be held, and to endure hardship in carrying a weapon that cannot defend you. Fabrizio said, "This question of yours has need, because it has so many items, of a long answer. It is true that I did not have the artillery fire more than one time, and because of it one remains in doubt. The reason is that it is more important to one to guard against being shot than shooting the enemy. You must understand that if you do not want the artillery to injure you, it is necessary to stay where it cannot reach you, or to put yourself behind a wall or embankment. Nothing else will stop it, but it is necessary for them to be very strong. Those captains who must make an engagement cannot remain behind walls or embankments, nor can they remain where it may reach them. They must, therefore, since they do not have a way of protecting themselves, find one by which they are injured less. Nor can they do anything other than to undertake it quickly. The way of doing this is to find it quickly and directly, not slowly or en masse, for speed does not allow them to shoot again, and because the men are scattered, they can injure only a few of them. A band of organized men cannot do this, because if they march in a straight line, they become disorganized, and if they scatter, they do not give the enemy the hard work to rout them, for they have routed themselves. And therefore I would organize the army so that it should be able to do both. For having placed 1,000 veliti in its wings, I would arrange that, after our artillery has fired, they should issue forth together with the light cavalry to seize the enemy artillery. And therefore I did not have my artillery fire again, so as not to give the enemy time, for you cannot give me time and take it from others. And for that, the reason I did not have it fire a second time was not to allow it to be fired first, because to render the enemy artillery useless there is no other remedy than to assault it, which, if the enemy abandons it, you seize it. If they want to defend it, it is necessary that they leave it behind, so that in the hands of the enemy or of friends it cannot be fired. I believe that, even without examples, this discussion should be enough for you. Yet, being able to give you some from the ancients, I will do so. End of Book 3, Part 1. Book 3, Part 2, of the Art of War. Ventidius, coming to battle with the Parthians, the virtue of whom in great part consisted in their bows and darts, he allowed them to come almost under his encampment before he led the army out, which he only did in order to be able to seize them quickly, and not give them time to fire. Caesar, in Gaul, tells that in coming to battle with the enemy, he was assaulted by them with such fury that his men did not have time to draw their darts, according to the Roman customs. It is seen, therefore, that being in the field, if you do not want something fired from a distance to injure you, there is no other remedy than to be able to seize it as quickly as possible. Another reason also caused me to do without firing the artillery, at which you may perhaps laugh, yet I do not judge it to be disparaged. There is nothing that causes greater confusion in an army than to obstruct its vision, whence most stalwart armies have been routed for having their vision obstructed, either by dust or by the sun. There is also nothing that impedes the vision more than the smoke which the artillery makes when fired. I would think, therefore, that it would be more prudent to let the enemy blind himself than for you to go blindly to find him. I would, therefore, not fire, or, as this would not be approved because of the reputation the artillery has, I would put it on the wings of the army, so that firing it, its smoke should not blind the front of what is most important of our forces. And that obstructing the vision of the enemy is something useful can be adduced from the example of Epaminondas, who, to blind the enemy army which was coming to engage him, had his light cavalry run in front of the enemy, so that they raised the dust high, which obstructed their vision, and gave him the victory in the engagement. As to it appearing to you that I aimed the shots of the artillery in my own manner, making it pass over the heads of the infantry, I reply that there are more times, and without comparison, that the heavy artillery does not penetrate the infantry than it does, because the infantry lies so low, and the artillery are so difficult to fire, that any little that you raise them causes them to pass over the heads of the infantry, and if you lower them, they damage the ground, and the shot does not reach the infantry. Also, the unevenness of the ground saves them, for every little mound or height which exists between the infantry and the artillery impedes it. And as to cavalry, and especially men-at-arms, because they are taller and can more easily be hit, they can be kept in the rear of the army until the time the artillery has fired. It is true that often they injure the smaller artillery and the gunners more than the latter, to which the best remedy is to come quickly to grips. And if in the first assault some are killed, as some always do die, a good captain and a good army do not have to fear an injury that is confined, but a general one. And to imitate the Swiss, who never shun an engagement, even if terrified by artillery, rather they punish with the capital penalty those who, because of fear of it, either break ranks or by their person give the sign of fear. I made them, once it had been fired, to retire into the army, because it left the passage free to the companies. No other mention of it was made, as something useless once the battle has started. You have also said, in regard to the fury of this instrument, that many judge the arms and the systems of the ancients to be useless. And it appears from your talk that the moderns have found an army and systems which are useful against the artillery. If you know this, I would be pleased for you to show it to me, for up to now I do not know of any that has been observed, nor do I believe any can be found. So I would like to learn from those men for what reasons the soldiers on foot of our times wear the breastplate or the corslet of iron, and those on horseback go completely covered with armour, since, condemning the ancient armour as useless with respect to the artillery, they ought also to shun these. I would also like to learn for what reason the Swiss, in imitation of the ancient systems, form a close company of 6,000 or 8,000 infantry, and for what reason all the others have imitated them, bringing the same dangers to this system because of the artillery as the others brought which had been imitated from antiquity. I believe that they would not know what to answer. But if you asked the soldiers, who should have some experience, they would answer, first, that they go armed, because even if that armour does not protect them from the artillery, it does every other injury inflicted by an enemy, and they would also answer that they go closely together, as the Swiss, in order to be better able to attack the infantry, resist the cavalry, and give the enemy more difficulty in routing them. So that it is observed that soldiers have to fear many other things beside the artillery, from which they defend themselves with armour and organisation. From which it follows that, as much as an army is better armed, and as much as its ranks are more serrated and more powerful, so much more is it secure. So that whoever is of the opinion you mentioned must be either of little prudence, or has thought very little on this matter. For if we see the least part of an ancient way of arming in use today, which is the pike, and the least part of those systems which are the battalions of the Swiss, which do us so much good and lend so much power to our armies, why shouldn't we believe that the other arms and other systems that they left us are also useful? Moreover, if we do not have any regard for the artillery when we place ourselves close together, like the Swiss, what other system than that can make us afraid? Inasmuch as there is no other arrangement that can make us afraid than that of being pressed together. In addition to this, if the enemy artillery does not frighten me when I lay siege to a town, where he may injure me with great safety to himself, and where I am unable to capture it as it is defended from the walls, but can stop him only with time with my artillery, so that he is able to redouble his shots as he wishes, why do I have to be afraid of him in the field, where I am able to seize him quickly? So I conclude this, that the artillery, according to my opinion, does not impede anyone who is able to use the methods of the ancients and demonstrate the ancient virtue. And if I had not talked another time with you concerning this instrument, I would extend myself further. But I want to return to what I have now said. Luigi said, "We are able to have a very good understanding, since you have so much discoursed about artillery, and in sum, it seems to me that you have shown that the best remedy one has against it, when he is in the field and having an army in an encounter, is to capture it quickly. Upon which a doubt rises in me, for it seems to me the enemy can so locate it on the side of his army from which he can injure you, and would be so protected by the other sides that it cannot be captured. You have, if you will remember, in your army's order for battle, created intervals of 4 arm lengths between one company and the next, and placed 20 of the extraordinary pikemen of the company there. If the enemy should organize his army similarly to yours, and place his artillery well within those intervals, I believe that from here he would be able to injure you with the greatest safety to himself, for it would not be possible to enter among the enemy forces to capture it." Fabrizio said, "You doubt very prudently, and I will endeavour either to resolve the doubt or give you a remedy. I have told you that these companies, either when going out or when fighting, are continually in motion, and by nature always end up close together, so that if you make the intervals small in which you would place the artillery, in a short time they would be so closed up that the artillery can no longer perform its function. If you make them large, to avoid this danger, you incur a greater, so that because of those intervals you not only give the enemy the opportunity to capture your artillery, but to rout you. But you have to know that it is impossible to keep the artillery between the ranks, especially those that are mounted on carriages, for the artillery travel in one direction and are fired in the other, so that if they are desired to be fired while travelling, it is necessary before they are fired that they be turned, and when they are being turned they need so much space that 50 carriages of artillery would disrupt every army. It is necessary, therefore, to keep them outside the ranks, where they can be operated in the manner which we showed you a short time ago. But let us suppose they can be kept there, and that a middle way can be found, and of a kind which, when closed together, should not impede the artillery, yet not be so open as to provide a path for the enemy. I see that this is easily remedied at the time of the encounter by creating intervals in your army which give a free path for its shots, and thus its fury will be useless, which can be easily done, because the enemy, if it wants its artillery to be safe, must place it at the end position of the intervals, so that its shots, if they should not harm its own men, must pass in a straight line and always in the same line, and therefore by giving them room can easily be avoided. Because this is a general rule, that you must give way to those things which cannot be resisted, as the ancients did to the elephants and chariots with sickles. I believe, rather, I am more than certain, that it must appear to you that I prepared and won an engagement in my own manner. None the less, I will repeat this, if what I have said up to now is not enough, that it would be impossible for an army thus organized and armed not to overcome, at the first encounter, every other army organized as modern armies are organized, which often, unless they have shields or swordsmen, do not form a front, and are of an unarmed kind, which cannot defend themselves from a near-by enemy, and so organized that, if they place their companies on the flanks next to each other, not having a way of receiving one another, they cause it to be confused, and apt to be easily disturbed. And although they give their armies 3 names, and divide them into 3 ranks, the vanguard, the company or main body, and the rear guard, none the less they do not serve for anything else than to distinguish them in marching and in their quarters, but in an engagement they are all pledged to the first attack and fortune. Luigi said, I have also noted that in making your engagement your cavalry was repulsed by the enemy cavalry, and that it retired among the extraordinary pikemen, whence it happened that with their aid they withstood and repulsed the enemy in the rear. I believe the pikemen can withstand the cavalry, as you said, but not a large and strong battalion, as the Swiss do, which in your army have 5 ranks of pikemen at the head, and 7 on the flank, so that I do not know how they are able to withstand them. Fabrizio said, Although I have told you that 6 ranks were employed in the phalanxes of Macedonia at one time, none the less you have to know that a Swiss battalion, if it were composed of 1,000 ranks, could not employ but 4, or at most 5, because the pikes are 9 arm-lengths long, and an arm-length and a half is occupied by the hands, whence only 7½ arm-lengths of the pike remain to the first rank. And the second rank, in addition to what the hand occupies, uses up an arm-length of the space that exists between one rank and the next, so that not even 6 arm-lengths of pike remain of use. For the same reasons there remain 4 1/2 arm-lengths to the third rank, 3 to the fourth, and 1½ to the fifth. The other ranks are useless to inflict injury, but they serve to replace the first ranks, as we have said, and serve as reinforcements for those first 5 ranks. If, therefore, 5 of their ranks can control cavalry, why cannot 5 of ours control them, to whom 5 ranks behind them are also not lacking to sustain them, and give the same support, even though they do not have pikes as the others do? And if the ranks of extraordinary pikemen, which are placed along the flanks, seem thin to you, they can be formed into a square, and placed by the flank of the 2 companies which I place in the last ranks of the army, from which place they would all together be able easily to help the van and the rear of the army, and lend aid to the cavalry according as their need may require.
Luigi said, Would you always use this form of organization when you would want to engage in battle? Fabrizio said, Not in every case, for you have to vary the formation of the army according to the fitness of the site, the kind and numbers of the enemy, which will be shown before this discussion is furnished with an example. But the formation that is given here, not so much because it is stronger than others, which is in truth very strong, as much because from it is obtained a rule and a system, to know how to recognize the manner of organization of the others. For every science has its generations, upon which in good part it is based. One thing only I would remind you, that you never organize an army so that whoever fights in the van cannot be helped by those situated behind, because whoever makes this error renders useless the great part of the army, and if any virtue is eliminated, he cannot win. Luigi said, And on this part some doubt has arisen in me. I have seen that in the disposition of the companies you form the front with 5 on each side, the centre with 3, and the rear with 2. And I would believe that it should be better to arrange them oppositely, because I think that an army can be routed with more difficulty.
for whoever should attack it, the more he should penetrate into it, so much harder would he find it. But the arrangement made by you appears to me results that the more one enters into it, the more he finds it weak." Fabrizio said, "If you would remember that the Triarii, who were the third rank of the Roman legions, were not assigned more than 600 men, you would have less doubt, when you leave, that they were placed in the last ranks, because you will see that I, motivated by this example, have placed 2 companies in the last ranks, which comprise 900 infantry, so that I come to err rather with the Roman people in having taken away too many than few. And although this example should suffice, I want to tell you the reasons, which is this: the first line of the army is made solid and dense because it has to withstand the attack of the enemy, and does not have to receive any friends into it, and because of this it must abound in men, for few men would make it weak both from their sparseness and their numbers. But the second line, because it has to receive the friends from the first line who have withstood the enemy, must have large intervals, and therefore must have a smaller number than the first. For if it should be of a greater or equal number, it would result in not leaving any intervals, which would cause disorder; or if some should be left, it would extend beyond the ends of those in front, which would make the formation of the army imperfect. And what you say is not true, that the more the enemy enters into the battalions, the weaker he will find them. For the enemy can never fight with the second line if the first one is not joined up with it, so that he will come to find the centre of the battalion stronger and not weaker, having to fight with the first and second lines together. The same thing happens if the enemy should reach the third line, because here he will not only have to fight with 2 fresh companies, but with the entire battalion. And as this last part has to receive more men, its spaces must be larger, and those who receive them lesser in number." Luigi said, "And I like what you have said, but also answer me this: if the 5 companies retire among the second 3, and afterwards the 8 among the third 2, it does not seem possible that the 8 come together and the 10 together, and are able to crowd together, whether they are 8 or 10, into the same space which the 5 occupied." Fabrizio said, "The first thing that I answer is that it is not the same space, for the 5 have 4 spaces between them, which they occupy when retiring between one battalion and the next, and that which exists between the 3 or the 2. There also remains that space which exists between the companies and the extraordinary pikemen, which spaces are all made large. There is added to this whatever other space the companies have when they are in the lines without being changed, for when they are changed, the ranks are either compressed or enlarged. They become enlarged when they are so very much afraid that they put themselves in flight. They are compressed when they become so afraid that they seek to save themselves not by flight but by defense, so that in this case they would compress themselves and not spread out. There is added to this that the 5 ranks of pikemen who are in front, once they have started the battle, have to retire among their companies in the rear of the army to make space for the shield-bearers, who are able to fight. And when they go into the rear of the army, they can serve whoever the captain should judge should employ them well, whereas in the front, once the fight becomes mixed, they would be completely useless. And therefore the arranged spaces come to be very capacious for the remaining forces. But even if these spaces should not suffice, the flanks on the side consist of men and not walls, who, when they give way and spread out, are able to create a space of such a capacity which should be sufficient to receive them. Luigi said, "The ranks of the extraordinary pikemen, which you place on the flank of the army, when the first company retires into the second, do you want them to remain firm and become as 2 wings of the army, or do you also want them to retire with the company? Which, if they have to do this, I do not see how they can, as they do not have companies behind them with wide intervals which would receive them." Fabrizio said, If the enemy does not fight them when he forces the companies to retire, they are able to remain firm in their ranks, and inflict injury on the enemy on the flank, since the first companies had retired. But if they should also fight them, as seems reasonable, being so powerful as to be able to force the others to retire, they should cause them also to retire, which they are very well able to do, even though they have no one behind who should receive them. For from the middle forward they are able to double on the right, one file entering into the other, in the manner we discussed when we talked of the arrangement for doubling themselves. It is true that when doubling they should want to retire behind, other means must be found than that which I have shown you, since I told you that the second rank has to enter among the first, the fourth among the third, and so on, little by little, and in this case it would not be begun from the front, but from the rear, so that doubling the ranks they should come to retire to the rear, and not to turn in front. But to reply to all of that which you have asked concerning this engagement as shown by me, it should be repeated, and I again say that I have organized this army, and will again explain this engagement to you, for two reasons: one, to show you how the army is organized; the other, to show you how it is trained. As to the systems, I believe you all most knowledgeable. As to the army, I tell you that it may often be put together in this form, for the heads are taught to keep their companies in this order. And because it is the duty of each individual soldier to keep well the arrangement of each company, and it is the duty of each head to keep well those in each part of the army, and to know well how to obey the commands of the general captain. They must know, therefore, how to join one company with another, and how to take their places instantly. And therefore the banner of each company must have its number displayed openly, so that they may be commanded, and the captain and the soldiers will more readily recognize that number. The battalions ought also to be numbered, and have their number on their principal banner. One must know, therefore, what the number is of the battalion placed on the left or right wing, the number of those placed in the front and the centre, and so on for the others. I would want also that these numbers reflect the grades of positions in the army. For instance, the first grade is the head of 10, the second is the head of 50 ordinary veliti, the third the centurion, the fourth the head of the first company, the fifth that of the second company, the sixth of the third, and so on up to the 10th company, which should be in the second place next to the general captain of the battalion. Nor should anyone arrive to that leadership unless he first has risen through all these grades. And as in addition to these heads there are the 3 constables in command of the extraordinary pikemen, and the 2 of the extraordinary veliti, I would want them to be of the grade of constable of the first company. Nor would I care if they were men of equal grade, as long as each of them should vie to be promoted to the second company. Each one of these captains, therefore, knowing where his company should be located, of necessity it will follow that, at the sound of the trumpet, once the captain's flag was raised, all of the army would be in its proper places. And this is the first exercise to which an army ought to become accustomed, that is, to assemble itself quickly. And to do this you must frequently each day arrange them and disarrange them. Luigi said, "What signs would you want the flags of the army to have, in addition to the number?" Fabrizio said, "I would want the one of the general captain to have the emblem of the army. All the others should also have the same emblem, but varying with the fields or with the sign, as it should seem best to the lord of the army. But this matters little so long as their effect results in their recognizing one another. But let us pass on to another exercise in which an army ought to be trained, which is to set it in motion, to march with a convenient step, and to see that, while in motion, it maintains order. The third exercise is that they be taught to conduct themselves as they would afterwards in an engagement, to fire the artillery and retire it, to have the extraordinary veliti issue forth, and after a mock assault have them retire. Have the first company, as if they were being pressed, retire within the intervals of the second company, and then both into the third, and from here each one to return to its place. and to so accustom them in this exercise that it becomes understood and familiar to everyone, which with practice and familiarity will readily be learned. The fourth exercise is that they be taught to recognize the commands of the captain by virtue of his bugle calls and flags, as they will understand without other command the pronouncements made by voice. And as the importance of the commands depends on the bugle calls, I will tell you what sounds or calls the ancients used. According as Thucydides confirms, whistles were often used in the army of the Lacedaemonians, for they judged that its pitch was more apt to make their army proceed with seriousness and not with fury. Motivated by the same reason, the Carthaginians, in their first assault, used the zither. Aleatus, king of the Lydians, used the zither and whistles in war. But Alexander the Great and the Romans used horns and trumpets, like those who thought the courage of the soldiers could be increased by virtue of such instruments, and cause them to combat more bravely. But just as we have borrowed from the Greek and Roman methods in equipping our army, so also in choosing sounds should we serve ourselves of the customs of both those nations. I would, therefore, place the trumpets next to the general captain, as their sound is apt not only to inflame the army, but to be heard over every noise more than any other sound. I would want that the other sounds existing around the constables and heads of companies to be made by small drums and whistles, sounded not as they are presently, but as they are customarily sounded at banquets. I would want, therefore, for the captain to use the trumpets in indicating when they should stop, or go forward, or turn back, when they should fire the artillery, when to move the extraordinary veleti, and by changes in these sounds or calls, point out to the army all those moves that generally are pointed out, and those trumpets afterwards followed by drums. And as training in these matters are of great importance, I would follow them very much in training your army. As to the cavalry, I would want to use the same trumpets, but of lower volume and different pitch of sounds from those of the captain. This is all that occurs to me concerning the organization and training of the army. Luigi said, "I beg you not to be so serious in clearing up another matter for me. Why did you have the light cavalry and the extraordinary veleti move with shouts and noise and fury when they attacked? But they, in rejoining the army, you indicated the matter was accomplished with great silence. And as I do not understand the reason for this fact, I would desire you to clarify it for me." Fabrizio said, "When coming to battle, there have been various opinions held by the ancient captains, whether they ought either to accelerate the step of the soldiers by sounds, or have them go slowly in silence. This last matter serves to keep the ranks firmer, and have them understand the commands of the captain better. The first serves to encourage the men more. And as I believe consideration ought to be given to both of these methods, I made the former move with sound, and the latter in silence. And it does not seem to me that in any case the sounds are planned to be continuous, for they would impede the commands, which is a pernicious thing. Nor is it reasonable that the Romans, after the first assault, should follow with such sounds, for it is frequently seen in their histories that the soldiers who were fleeing were stopped by the words and advice of the captains, and changed the orders in various ways by his command, which would not have occurred if the sounds had overcome his voice. End of Book 3.
Book 4 of the Art of War. Luigi said, "Since an engagement has been won so honourably under my rule, I think it is well if I do not tempt fortune further, knowing how changeable and unstable it is. And therefore I desire to resign my speakership, and that, wanting to follow the order that belongs to the youngest, Zenobi now assume this office of questioning. And I know he will not refuse this honour, or we would rather say this hard work, as much in order to give pleasure as also because he is naturally more courageous than I. Nor should he be afraid to enter into these labours, where he can thus be overcome as he can overcome." Zenobi said, "I intend to stay where you put me, even though I would more willingly stay to listen, because up to now I am more satisfied with your questions than those which occurred to me in listening to your discussions pleased me.
But I believe it is well, lords, since you have time left, and have patience, we do not annoy you with these ceremonies of ours." Fabrizio said, "Rather you give me pleasure, because this change of questioners makes me know the various geniuses and your various desires. Is there anything remaining of the matter discussed which you think should be added?" Zenobi said, "There are two things I desire before we pass on to another part. The one is that you would show me if there is another form of organizing the army which may occur to you. The other, what considerations ought a captain have before going to battle, and if some accident should arise concerning it, what remedies can be made?" Fabrizio said, "I will make an effort to satisfy you. I will not reply to your questions in detail, for when I answer one, often it will also answer another. I have told you that I proposed a form for the army which should fill all the requirements according to the nature of the enemy and the site, because in this case one proceeds according to the site and the enemy. But note this, that there is no greater peril than to overextend the front of your army, unless you have a very large and very brave army. Otherwise you have to make it rather wide and of short length, than of long length and very narrow. For when you have a small force compared to the enemy, you ought to seek other remedies. For example, arrange your army so that you are girded on a side by rivers or swamps, so that you cannot be surrounded, or gird yourself on the flanks with ditches, as Caesar did in Gaul. In this case you have to take the flexibility of being able to enlarge or compress your front, according to the numbers of the enemy. And if the enemy is of a lesser number, you ought to seek wide places, especially if you have your forces so disciplined that you are able not only to surround the enemy, but extend your ranks, because in rough and difficult places you do not have the advantage of being able to avail yourself of all your ranks. Hence it happened that the Romans almost always sought open fields, and avoided the difficult ones. On the other hand, as I have said, you ought, if you have either a small force or a poorly disciplined one, to seek places where a small number can defend you, or where inexperience may not cause you injury. Also, higher places ought to be sought, so as to be able more easily to attack the enemy. And nonetheless, one ought to be aware not to arrange your army on a beach and in a place near the adjoining hills, where an enemy army can come, because in this case, with respect to the artillery, the higher place would be disadvantageous to you, because you could continuously and conveniently be harmed by the enemy artillery, without being able to undertake any remedy, and similarly impeded by your own men, you cannot conveniently injure him. Whoever organizes an army for battle ought also to have regard for both the sun and the wind, that the one and the other do not strike the front, because both impede your vision, the one with its rays, the other with dust. And in addition, the wind does not aid the arms that are thrown at the enemy, and makes their blows more feeble. And as to the sun, it is not enough that you take care that it is not in your face at the time, but you must think about it not harming you when it comes up. And because of this, in arranging the army, I would have the sun behind them, so that much time should pass before it should come in front of you. This method was observed by Hannibal at Cannae, and by Marius against the Cimbrians. If you should be greatly inferior in cavalry, arrange your army between vines and trees and such impediments, as the Spaniards did in our time when they routed the French in the kingdom of Naples on the Cerignola. And it has been frequently seen that the same soldiers, when they changed only their arrangement and location, from being overcome became victorious, as happened to the Carthaginians, who, after having been often defeated by Marius Regulus, were afterwards victorious through the counsel of Xantippe, the Lacedaemonian, who had them descend to the plain, where, by virtue of their cavalry and elephants, they were able to overcome the Romans. And it appears to me, according to the examples of the ancients, that almost all the excellent captains, when they learned that the enemy had strengthened one side of the company, did not attack the stronger side, but the weaker, and the other stronger side they opposed to the weaker. Then, when starting a battle, they cornered the stronger part, that it only resist the enemy, and not push it back, and the weaker part, that it allow itself to be overcome, and retire into the rear ranks of the army. This causes two great disorders to the enemy. The first, that he finds his stronger part surrounded, The second is that, as it appears to them they will obtain victory quickly, it rarely happens that he will not become disorganized, whence his defeat quickly results. Cornelius Scipio, when he was in Spain, fighting against Hasdrubal the Carthaginian, and knowing that Hasdrubal, in arranging the army, placed his legions in the centre, which constituted the strongest part of his army, and therefore when Hasdrubal was to proceed in this manner afterwards, when he came to the engagement, changed the arrangement, and put his legions in the wings of the army, and placed his weaker forces in the centre. Then, when they came hand to hand, he quickly had those forces in the centre to walk slowly, and the wings to move forward swiftly, so that only the wings of both armies fought, and the ranks in the centre, being distant from each other, did not join in battle, and thus the strongest part of the army of Scipio came to fight the weakest part of that of Hasdrubal, and defeated it. This method at that time was useful, but today, because of the artillery, could not be employed, because that space that existed between one and the other army gives them time to fire, which is most pernicious, as was said above. This method, therefore, must be set aside, and be used, as was said a short time ago, when all the army is engaged, and the weaker part made to yield. When a captain finds himself to have an army larger than that of the enemy, and not wanting to be prevented from surrounding him, arranges his army with fronts equal to those of the enemy, and when the battle is started, has his front retire, and the flanks extend little by little, and it will always happen that the enemy will find himself surrounded without being aware of it. When a captain wants to fight almost secure in not being routed, he arranges his army in a place where he has a safe refuge nearby, either amid swamps or mountains, or in a powerful city. For in this manner he cannot be pursued by the enemy, but the enemy cannot be pursued by him. This means was employed by Hannibal when fortune began to become adverse for him, and he was apprehensive of the valor of Marcus Marcellus. Several, in order to disorganize the ranks of the enemy, have commanded those who are lightly armed that they begin the fight, and having begun it, retire among the ranks. Then, when the armies afterwards have joined fronts together, and each front is occupied in fighting, they have allowed them to issue forth from the flanks of the companies, and disorganized and routed them. If anyone finds himself inferior in cavalry, he can, in addition to the methods mentioned, place a company of pikemen behind his cavalry, and in the fighting arrange for them to give way for the pikemen, and he will always remain superior. Many have accustomed some of the lightly armed infantry to get used to combat amidst the cavalry, and this has been a very great help to the cavalry. Of all those who have organized armies for battle, the most praiseworthy have been Hannibal and Scipio when they were fighting in Africa. And as Hannibal had his army composed of Carthaginians and auxiliaries of various kinds, he placed 80 elephants in the front van, and then placed the auxiliaries. After these he placed the Carthaginians, and in the rear he placed the Italians, whom he trusted little. He arranged matters thusly because the auxiliaries, having the enemy in front and their rear closed by his men, they could not flee, so that being compelled to fight, they should overcome or tire out the Romans, thinking afterwards, with his forces of virtue fresh, he could easily overcome the already tired Romans. In the encounter with this arrangement, Scipio placed the Astati, the Principi, and the Triari in the accustomed fashion, for one to be able to receive the other, and one to help the other. He made the vans of the army full of intervals, and so that they should not be seen through, but rather appear united, he filled them with veliti, whom he commanded that, as soon as the elephants arrived, they should give way, and enter through the regular spaces among the legions, and leave the way open to the elephants, and thus come to render the attack vain, so that coming hand to hand with him, he was superior. Zenobie said, "You have made me remember, in telling me of this engagement, that Scipio, during the fight, did not have the Astati retire into the ranks of the Principi, but divided them, and had them retire into the wings of the army, so as to make room for the Principi if he wanted to push them forward. I would desire, therefore, that you tell me what reason motivated him not to observe the accustomed arrangement." Fabrizio said, "I will tell you. Hannibal had placed all the virtue of his army in the second line, whence Scipio, in order to oppose a similar virtue to it, assembled the Principi and the Triarii, so that the intervals of the Principi being occupied by the Triarii, there was no place to receive the Astati, and therefore he caused the Astati to be divided and enter the wings of the army, and did not bring them among the Principi. But take note that this method of opening up the first lines to make a place for the second cannot be employed except when the other are superior, because then the convenience exists to be able to do it, as Scipio was able to. But being inferior and repulsed, it cannot be done except with your manifest ruin. And therefore you must have ranks in the rear which will receive you. But let us return to our discussion. The ancient Asiatics, among other things thought up by them to injure the enemy, used chariots which had scythes on their sides, so that they not only served to open up the lines with their attack, but also kill the adversary with the scythes. Provisions against these attacks were made in three ways. It was resisted by the density of the ranks, or they were received within the lines, as were the elephants, or a stalwart resistance was made with some stratagems, as did Sulla the Roman against Archelaus, who had many of those chariots which they called falcati. He, Sulla, in order to resist them, fixed many poles in the ground behind the first ranks, by which the chariots, being resisted, lost their impetus. And note is to be taken of the new method which Sulla used against this man in arranging the army, since he put the veliti and the cavalry in the rear, and all the heavily armed in front, leaving many intervals in order to be able to send those in the rear forward if necessity should require it. Whence, when the battle was started, with the aid of the cavalry, to whom he gave the way, he obtained the victory. To want to worry the enemy during the battle, something must be made to happen which dismays him, either by announcing new help which is arriving, or by showing things which look like it, so that the enemy, being deceived by that sight, becomes frightened. And when he is frightened, he can be easily overcome. These methods were used by the Roman consuls Minucius Rufus and Icilius Glabrius. Caius Sulpicius also placed many soldier packs on mules and other animals useless in war, but in a manner that they looked like men-at-arms, and commanded that they appear on a hill while they were in hand-to-hand combat with the Gauls, whence his victory resulted. Marius did the same when he was fighting against the Germans. Feigned assaults, therefore, being of great value while the battle lasts, it happens that many are benefited by the real assaults, especially if, improvised in the middle of the battle, it is able to attack the enemy from behind or on the sides, which can be done only with difficulty, unless the nature of the company helps you. For if it is open, part of your forces cannot be speeded, as must be done in such enterprises. But in wooded or mountainous places, and hence capable of ambush, part of your forces can be well hidden, so that the enemy may be assaulted suddenly and without his expecting it, which will always be the cause of giving you the victory. And sometimes it has been very important, while the battle goes on, to plant voices which announce the death of the enemy captain, or the defeat of some other part of the army, and this often has given the victory to whoever used it. The enemy cavalry may be easily disturbed by unusual sights or noises, as did Croesus, who opposed camels to the cavalry of his adversaries, and Pyrrhus, who opposed elephants to the Roman cavalry, the sight of which disturbed and disorganized it. In our times the Turk routed the Shah in Persia and the Soldan in Syria with nothing else than the noise of guns, which so affected their cavalry by their unaccustomed noises that the Turk was able easily to defeat it. The Spaniards, to overcome the army of Hamilcar, placed in their first lines chariots full of tow drawn by oxen, and when they had come to battle set fire to them, whence the oxen, wanting to flee the fire, hurled themselves on the army of Hamilcar and dispersed it. As we mentioned, where the country is suitable, it is usual to deceive the enemy when in combat by drawing him into ambushes. But when it is open and spacious, many have employed the digging of ditches, and then covering them lightly with earth and branches, but leaving several spaces solid, in order to be able to retire between them. Then, when the battle is started, retire through them, and the enemy pursuing comes to ruin in them. If, during the battle, some accident befalls you, which dismays your soldiers, it is a most prudent thing to know how to dissimulate and divert them to something good, as did Lucius Sulla, who, while the fighting was going on, seeing that a great part of his forces had gone over to the side of the enemy, and that this had dismayed his men, quickly caused it to be understood throughout the entire army that everything was happening by his order, and this not only did not disturb the army, but so increased its courage that it was victorious. It also happened to Sulla that, having sent certain soldiers to undertake certain business, and they having been killed, in order that his army would not be dismayed, said that, because he had found them unfaithful, he had cunningly sent them into the hands of the enemy. Sertorius, when undertaking an engagement in Spain, killed one who had pointed out to him the slaying of one of his heads, for fear that, by telling the same to others, he should dismay them. It is a difficult matter to stop an army already in flight, and return it to battle. And you have to make this distinction: either they are entirely in flight, and here it is impossible to return them, or only a part are in flight, and here there is some remedy. Many Roman captains, by getting in front of those fleeing, have stopped them by making them ashamed of their flight, as did Lucius Sulla, who, when a part of his legions had already turned, driven by the forces of Mithridates, with his sword in hand he got in front of them and shouted, "If anyone asks you where you have left your captain, tell them we have left him in Boeotia fighting." The consul Attilius opposed those who fled with those who did not flee, and made them understand that if they did not turn about, they would be killed by both friends and enemies. Philip of Macedonia, when he learned that his men were afraid of the Scythian soldiers, put some of his most trusted cavalry behind his army, and commissioned them to kill anyone who fled, whence his men, preferring to die fighting rather than in flight, won. Many Romans, not so much in order to stop a flight as to give his men an occasion to exhibit greater prowess while they were fighting, have taken a banner out of their hands, and tossing it amid the enemy, offered rewards to whoever would retrieve it. I do not believe it is out of order to add to this discussion those things that happen after a battle, especially as they are brief, and not to be omitted, and conform greatly to this discussion. I will tell you, therefore, how engagements are lost or are won. When one wins, he ought to follow up the victory with all speed, and imitate Caesar in this case, and not Hannibal, who, because he had stopped after he had defeated the Romans at Cannae, lost the empire of Rome. The other, Caesar, never rested after a victory, but pursued the routed army with great impetus and fury until he had completely assaulted it. But when one loses, a captain ought to see if something useful can result from this loss, especially if some residue of the army remains to him. An opportunity can arise from the unawareness of the enemy, which frequently becomes obscured after a victory, and gives you the occasion to attack him. As Martius, the Roman, attacked the Carthaginian army, which, having killed the two Scipios and defeated their armies, thought little of that remnant of the forces, who, with Martius, remained alive, and was in turn attacked and routed by him. It is seen, therefore, that there is nothing so capable of success as that which the enemy believes you cannot attempt, because men are often injured more when they are less apprehensive. A captain ought, therefore, when he cannot do this, at least endeavour with industry to restrict the injury caused by the defeat. And to do this, it is necessary for you to take steps that the enemy is not able to follow you easily, or give him cause for delay. In the first case, some, after they realize they are losing, order their leaders to flee to several parts by different paths, having first given an order where they should afterwards reassemble, so that the enemy, fearing to divide his forces, would leave all or a greater part of them safe. In the second case, many have thrown down their most precious possessions in front of the enemy, so that, being retarded by plundering, he gave them more time for flight. Titus Dimmius used not a little astuteness in hiding the injury received in battle, for, after he had fought until nightfall with the loss of many of his men, caused a good many of them to be buried during the night; whence in the morning the enemy, seeing so many of their dead and so few Romans, believing they had the disadvantage, fled. I believe I have thus confused you, as I said, but satisfied your question in good part. It is true that concerning the shape of the army there remains for me to tell you how sometimes it is customary for some captains to make the front in the form of a wedge, judging in that way to be more able readily to penetrate the army of the enemy. In opposition to this shape they customarily would form a scissor, so as to be able to receive that wedge into that space, and surround and fight it from every side. On this I would like you to have this general rule, that the greatest remedy used against the design of the enemy is to do that willingly which he designs for you to do by force, because, doing it willingly, you do it with order and to your advantage, but to his disadvantage. If you should do it by force, it would be to your ruin. As to the fortifying of this, I would not care to repeat anything already said. Does the adversary make a wedge in order to open your ranks? If you proceed with yours open, you disorganize him, and he does not disorganize you. Hannibal placed elephants in front of his army to open that of the army of Scipio. Scipio went with his open, and was the cause of his own victory and the ruin of Hannibal. Hasdrubal placed his most stalwart forces in the centre of the van of his army to push back the forces of Scipio. Scipio commanded in like fashion that they should retire, and defeated him. So that such plans, when they are put forward, are the cause of the victory of him against whom they were organized. It remains for me yet, if I remember well, to tell you what considerations a captain ought to take into account before going into battle. Upon which I have to tell you first that a captain never has to make an engagement if he does not have the advantage, or if he is not compelled to. Advantages arise from the location, from the organization, and from having either greater or better forces. Necessity or compulsion arises when you see that by not fighting you must lose in any event. For example, when you see you are about to lack money, and therefore your army has to be dissolved in any case, when hunger is about to assail you, or when you expect the enemy to be reinforced again by new forces. In these cases one ought always to fight, even at your disadvantage, for it is much better to try your fortune when it can favour you, than by not trying when you see your ruin sure. And in such a case it is as serious an error for a captain not to fight as it is to pass up an opportunity to win either from ignorance or from cowardice. The enemy sometimes gives you the advantage, and sometimes it derives from your prudence. Many have been routed while crossing a river by an alert enemy of theirs, who waited until they were in the middle of the stream, and then assaulted them on every side, as Caesar did to the Swiss, when he destroyed a fourth part of them after they had been split by the river. Sometime you may find your enemy tired from having pursued you too inconsiderately, so that, finding yourself fresh and rested, you ought not to lose such an opportunity. In addition to this, if an enemy offers you battle at a good hour of the morning, you can delay going out of your encampment for many hours. And if he has been under arms for a long time, and has lost that first ardor with which he started, you can then fight with him. Scipio and Metellus employed this method in Spain, the first against Hasdrubal, and the other against Sertorius. If the enemy had diminished in strength, either from having divided the armies, as the Scipios did in Spain, or from some other cause, you ought to try your fortune. The greater part of prudent captains would rather receive the onrush of the enemy who impetuously go to assault them, for their fury is easily withstood by firm and resolute men, and that fury which was withstood easily converts itself into cowardice. Fabius acted thusly against the Samnites and against the Gauls, and was victorious, but his colleague Decius was killed. Some who feared the virtue of their enemy have begun the battle at an hour near nightfall, so that if their men were defeated they might be able to be protected by its darkness and save themselves. Some, having known that the enemy army, because of certain superstitions, does not want to undertake fighting at such a time, selected that time for battle, and won, which Caesar did in Gaul against Ariovistus, and Vespasianus in Syria against the Jews. The greater and more important awareness that a captain ought to have is to see that he has about him men loyal and most expert in war, and prudent, with whom he counsels continuously, and discusses his forces and those of the enemy with them, which are the greater in number, which are better armed or better trained, which are more apt to suffer deprivation, which to confide in more, the infantry or the cavalry. Also they consider the location in which they are, and if it is more suitable for the enemy than for themselves, which of them has the better convenience of supply, whether it is better to delay the engagement or undertake it, and what benefit the weather might give you or take away from them. For often, when the soldiers see the war becoming long, they become irritable, and, weary from hard work and tedium, will abandon you. Above all, it is important for the captain to know the enemy, and who he has around him, if he is foolhardy or cautious, if timid or audacious. See whether you can trust the auxiliary soldiers. And above all, you ought to guard against leading an army into battle which is afraid or distrustful in any way of victory, for the best indication of defeat is when one believes he cannot win. And therefore, in this case, you ought to avoid an engagement, either by doing as Fabius Maximus did, who, by encamping in strong places, did not give Hannibal courage to go and meet him, or by believing that the enemy, also in strong places, should come to meet you. You should depart from the field, and divide your forces among your towns, so that the tedium of capturing them will tire him. Zenobie said, "Can he not avoid the engagement in other ways than by dividing the army into several parts, and putting them in towns?" Fabrizio said, "I believe at another time I have discussed with some of you that whoever is in the field cannot avoid an engagement if he has an enemy who wants to fight in any case. And he has but one remedy, and that is to place himself with his army at least 50 miles distant from his adversary, so as to be in time to get out of his way if he should come to meet him. And Fabius Maximus never avoided an engagement with Hannibal, but wanted it at his advantage. And Hannibal did not presume to be able to overcome him by going to meet him in the places where he encamped. But if he supposed he could defeat him, it was necessary for Fabius to undertake an engagement with him in any case, or to flee. Philip, king of Macedonia, he who was the father of Perseus, coming to war with the Romans, placed his encampment on a very high mountain, so as not to have an engagement with them. But the Romans went to meet him on that mountain and routed him. Vercingetorix, a captain of the Gauls, in order to avoid an engagement with Caesar, who unexpectedly had crossed the river, placed himself miles distant with his forces. The Venetians in our times, if they did not want to come to an engagement with the King of France, ought not to have waited until the French army had crossed the Adda, but should have placed themselves distant from him, as did Vercingetorix. Whence, having waited for him, they did not know how to take the opportunity of undertaking an engagement during the crossing, nor how to avoid it. For the French, being near to them, as the Venetians decamped, assaulted and routed them. And so it is that an engagement cannot be avoided if the enemy at all events wants to undertake it. Nor does anyone cite Fabius, for he avoided an engagement in cases like that just as much as did Hannibal. It often happens that your soldiers are not willing to fight, and you know that because of their number or the location, or from some other cause, you have a disadvantage, and would like them to change their minds. It also happens that necessity or opportunity constrains you to come to an engagement, and that your soldiers are discontent and little disposed to fight, whence it is necessary for you in one case to frighten them, and in the other to excite them. In the first instance, if persuasion is not enough, there is no better way to have both those who fight and those who would not believe you than to give some of them over to the enemy as plunder. It may also be well to do with cunning that which happened to Fabius Maximus at home. The army of Fabius desired, as you know, to fight with the army of Hannibal. His master of cavalry had the same desire. It did not seem proper to Fabius to attempt the battle, so that, in order to dispel such desires, he had to divide the army. Fabius kept his men in the encampments, and the other, the master of cavalry, going forth and coming into great danger, would have been routed if Fabius had not succoured him. By this example, the master of the cavalry, together with the entire army, realized it was a wise course to obey Fabius. As to exciting them to fight, it is well to make them angry at the enemy, by pointing out that the enemy say slanderous things of them, and showing them to have with their intelligence in the enemy camp, and having corrupted some part, to encamp on the side where they see the enemy, and undertake some light skirmishes with them, because things that are seen daily are more easily disparaged. By showing yourself indignant, and by making an oration in which you reproach them for their laziness, you make them so ashamed by saying you want to fight only if they do not accompany you. And above everything, to have this awareness, if you want to make the soldiers obstinate in battle, not to permit them to send home any of their possessions, or settle in any place, until the war ends, so that they understand that if flight saves them their lives, it will not save them their possessions. The love of the latter, not less than the former, renders men obstinate in defence. Zenobie said, "You have told how soldiers can be made to turn and fight, by talking to them. Do you mean by this that he has to talk to the entire army, or to its heads?" Fabrizio said, "To persuade or dissuade a few from something is very easy, for if words are not enough, you can use authority and force. But the difficulty is to take away a sinister idea from a multitude, whether it may be in agreement or contrary to your own opinion, where only words can be used, which, if you want to persuade everyone, must be heard by everyone. Captains, therefore, must be excellent orators, for without knowing how to talk to the entire army, good things can only be done with difficulty, which, in these times of ours, is completely done away with. Read the biography of Alexander the Great, and see how many times it was necessary to harangue and speak publicly to the army. Otherwise he could never have led them, having become rich and full of plunder, through the deserts of Arabia and into India, with so much hardship and trouble. For infinite numbers of things arose by which an army is ruined if a captain does not know how, or is not accustomed to talking to it. For this speaking takes away fear, incites courage, increases obstinacy, and sweeps away deceptions, promises rewards, points out dangers and the ways to avoid them, reprimands, begs, threatens, fills with hope, praises, slanders, and does away all those things by which human passion are extinguished or enkindled. Whence that prince or republic planning to raise a new army, and to give this army reputation, ought to accustom the soldiers to listen to the talk of the captain, and the captain to know how to talk to them. Religion was also of much value in keeping the ancient soldiers well disposed, and an oath was taken by them when they came into the army. For whenever they made a mistake, they were threatened not only by those evils that can be feared by men, but also by those that can be expected from the Deity. This practice, mixed with other religious means, often made an entire enterprise easy for the ancient captains, and would always be so whenever religion was feared and observed. Sertorius availed himself of this when he told of talking with a hind or female stag, which promised him victory on the part of the Deity. Sulla was said to talk with a statue which he had taken from the temple of Apollo. Many have told of God appearing to them in their sleep and admonishing them to fight. In the times of our fathers, Charles VII, King of France, in the war he waged against the English, was said to counsel with a young girl sent by God, who was called the Maid of France, and who was the cause for victory. You can also take means to make your soldiers value the enemy little, as Agesilaus the Spartan did, who showed his soldiers some Persians in the nude, so that, seeing their delicate members, they should have no cause for being afraid of them. Some have constrained them to fight from necessity, by removing from their paths all hope of saving themselves except through victory. This is the strongest and the best provision that can be made when you want to make your soldiers obstinate, which obstinacy is increased by the confidence and the love either of the captain or of the country. Confidence is instilled by arms organization, fresh victories, and the knowledge of the captain. Love of country springs from nature, that of the captain from his virtue more than any other good event. Necessities can be many, but that is the strongest which constrains you either to win or to die. End of Book 4. Book 5, Part 1 of The Art of War. Fabrizio said, "I have shown you how to organize an army to battle another army which is seen posted against you, and I have told you how it is overcome, and also of the many circumstances which can occur because of the various incidents surrounding it, so that it appears to me now to be the time to show you how to organize an army against an enemy which is unseen, but which you are continually afraid will assault you. This happens when marching through country which is hostile, or suspected of being so. And first you have to understand that a Roman army ordinarily always sent ahead some groups of cavalry as observers for the march. Afterwards the right wing followed. After this came all the wagons which pertained to it. After those another legion, and next its wagons. After these come the left wing with its wagons in the rear, and the remainder of the cavalry followed in the last part. This was in effect the manner in which one ordinarily marched, and if it happened that the army should be assaulted on the march in front or from the rear, they quickly caused all the wagons to be withdrawn either on the right or on the left, according as it happened, or rather as best they could, depending on the location, and all the forces together, free from their baggage, set up a front on that side from which the enemy was coming. If they were assaulted on the flank, they would withdraw the wagons to the side which was secure, and set up a front on the other. This method, being good and prudently conducted, appears to me ought to be imitated, sending cavalry ahead to observe the country, then having 4 battalions, having the march in line, and each with its wagons in the rear. And as the wagons are of 2 kinds, that is, those pertaining to individual soldiers, and the public ones for use by the whole camp, I would divide the public wagons into 4 parts, and assign a part to each battalion, also dividing the artillery and all the unarmed men, so that each one of those armed should have its equal share of the impedimenta. But as it sometimes happens that one marches in a country not only suspect, but hostile in fact, that you are afraid of being attacked hourly, in order to go more securely, you are compelled to change the formation of the march, and go on in the regular way, so that in some unforeseen place neither the inhabitants nor the army can injure you. In such a case the ancient captains usually went on with the army in squares, for such they called these formations, not because it was entirely square, but because it was capable of fighting on 4 sides, and they said they were going prepared either for marching or for battle. I do not want to stray far from this method, and want to arrange my 2 battalions, which I have taken as a rule for an army, in this manner. If you want, therefore, to walk securely through the enemy country, and be able to respond from every side, if you had been assaulted by surprise and wanting in accordance with the ancients to bring it into a square, I would plan to make a square whose hollow was 200 arm lengths on every side, in this manner. I would first place the flanks, each distant from the other by 212 arm lengths, and would place 5 companies in each flank, in a file along its length, and distant from each other 3 arm lengths. These would occupy their own space, each company occupying a space 40 arm lengths by 212 arm lengths. Between the front and rear of these 2 flanks I would place another 10 companies, 5 on each side, arranging them in such a way that 4 should be next to the front of the right flank, and 5 at the rear of the left flank, leaving between each one an interval or gap of 4 arm lengths, one of which should be next to the front of the left flank, and one at the rear of the right flank. And as the space existing between the one flank and the other is 212 arm lengths, and these companies placed alongside each other by their width and not length, they would come to occupy, with the intervals, 134 arm lengths, and there would be between the 4 companies placed on the front of the right flank and one placed on the left a remaining space of 78 arm lengths, and a similar space be left among the companies placed in the rear parts. And there would be no other difference except that one space would be on the rear side towards the right wing, the other would be on the front side towards the left wing. In the space of 78 arm lengths, in front I would place all the ordinary veleti, and that in the rear the extraordinary veleti, who would come to be 1,000 per space. And if you want that the space taken up by the army should be 212 arm lengths on every side, I would see that 5 companies are placed in front, and those that are placed in the rear should not occupy any space already occupied by the flanks, and therefore I would see that the 5 companies in the rear should have their front touch the rear of their flanks, and those in the front should have their rear touch the front of their flanks, so that on every side of the army space would remain to receive another company. And as there are 4 spaces, I would take 4 banners away from the extraordinary pikemen, and would put one on every corner. And the 2 banners of the aforementioned pikemen left to me I would place in the middle of the hollow of their army, formed in a square of companies, at the heads of which the general captain would remain with his men around him. And as these companies so arranged all march in one direction, but not all fight in one, in putting them together one has to arrange which sides are not guarded by other companies during the battle. And therefore it ought to be considered that the 5 companies in front protect all the other sides except the front, and therefore these have to be assembled in an orderly manner, and with the pikemen in front. The 5 companies behind protect all the sides except the side in the back, and therefore ought to be assembled so that the pikemen are in the rear, as we will demonstrate in its place. The 5 companies on the right flank protect all the sides from the right flank outward. The 5 on the left engird all the sides from the left flank outward. And therefore, in arranging the companies, the pikemen ought to be placed so that they turn by that flank which is uncovered. And as the heads of 10 are placed in the front and rear, so that when they have to fight, all the army and its members are in their proper places, the manner of accomplishing this was told when we discussed the methods of arranging the companies. I would divide the artillery, and one part I would place outside the right flank, and the other at the left. I would send the light cavalry ahead to reconnoitre the country. Of the men-at-arms, I would place part in the rear on the right wing, and part on the left, distant 40 arm lengths from the companies. And no matter how you arrange your army, you have to take up as the cavalry this general rule, that you have to place them always either in the rear or on the flanks. Whoever places them ahead in front of the army must do one of 2 things. Either he places them so far ahead that if they are repulsed they have so much room to give them time to be able to obtain shelter for themselves from your infantry and not collide with them, or to range them, the infantry, with so many intervals that by means of them the cavalry can enter among them without disorganizing them. Let not anyone think little of this instruction, because many, not being aware of this, have been ruined and have been disorganized and routed by themselves. The wagons and the unarmed men are placed in the plaza that exists within the army, and so compartmented that they easily make way for whoever wants to go from one side to the other, or from one front of the army to the other. These companies, without artillery and cavalry, occupy 280 arm lengths of space on the outside in every direction, and as this square is composed of 2 battalions, it must be devised as to which part one battalion makes up, and which part the other. And since the battalions are called by number, and each of them has, as you know, 10 companies and a general head, I would have the 1st battalion place its first 5 companies in the front, and the other 5 on the left flank, and the head should be in the left angle of the front. The first 5 companies of the 2nd battalion then should be placed on the right flank, and the other 5 in the rear, and the head should be in the right angle, who would undertake the office of tergitatore. The army, organized in this manner, is ready to move, and in its movement should completely observe this arrangement, and without doubt it is secure from all the tumults of the inhabitants. Nor ought the captain make other provisions against these tumultuous assaults than sometimes to give a commission to some cavalry or band of veliti to put them in their place. Nor will it ever happen that these tumultuous people will come to meet you with the drawing of sword or pike, because disorderly people are afraid of order. And it will always be seen that they make a great assault with shouts and noises without otherwise approaching you, in the way of yelping dogs around a mastiff. Hannibal, when he came to harm from the Romans in Italy, passed through all of France, and always took little account of the tumults of the French. When you want to march, you must have levellers and men with pickaxes ahead, who clear the road for you, and who are well protected by that cavalry sent ahead to reconnoitre. An army will march in this order 10 miles a day, and enough sun and light will remain for them to dine and camp, since ordinarily an army marches 20 miles. If it happens that it is assaulted by an organized army, this assault cannot arise suddenly, because an organized army travels at its own rate, so that you are always in time to reorganize for the engagement, and quickly bring yourself to that formation, or similar to that formation, of the army which I showed you above. For if you are assaulted on the front side, you do nothing except to have the artillery in the flanks and the cavalry behind come forward and take those places and with those distances mentioned above. The 1,000 veliti who are forward come forth from their positions, and dividing into groups of 100, enter into their places between the cavalry and the wings of the army. Then into the voids left by them enter the 2 bands of extraordinary pikemen, which I had placed in the plaza of the army. The 1,000 veliti that I had placed in the rear depart from there and distribute themselves among the flanks of the companies to strengthen them, and from the open space they leave, all the wagons and unarmed men issue forth and place themselves in the rear of the companies. The plaza, therefore, remains vacant, as everyone has gone to their places, and the 5 companies that I placed in the rear of the army come forward through the open void that exists between the one and the other flank, and march toward the company in the front, and the 3 approach them at 40 arm lengths, with equal intervals between one another, and 2 remain behind, distant another 40 arm lengths. This formation can be organized quickly, and comes to be almost the same as the first disposition of the army which we described before. And if it becomes more straightened at the front, it becomes larger in the flanks, which does not weaken it. But as the 5 companies in the back have their pikemen in the rear for the reasons mentioned above, it is necessary to have them come from the forward part, if you want them to get behind the front of the army. And therefore one must either make them turn company by company as a solid body, or make them enter quickly between the ranks of the shield-bearers or swordsmen, and bring them forward, which method is more swift and less disorderly than to make them turn. And thus you ought to do with all those who are in the rear in every kind of assault, as I will show you. If it should happen that the enemy comes from the rear, the first thing that ought to be done is to have everyone turn to face the enemy, so that at once the front of the army becomes the rear, and the rear the front. Then all those methods of organizing the front should be followed which I mentioned above. If the enemy attacks on the right flank, the entire army ought to be made to face in that direction, and then those things ought to be done to strengthen that new front which were mentioned above, so that the cavalry, the veliti, and the artillery are in the position assigned in this front. There is only this difference, that in the changing of fronts, of those who move about, some have to go further and some less. It is indeed true that when a front is made on the right flank, the veliti would have to enter the intervals or gaps that exist between the wings of the army, and the cavalry would be those nearer to the left flank, in the position of those who would have to enter into the 2 bands of extraordinary pikemen placed in the centre. But before they enter, the wagons and unarmed men stationed at the openings should clear the plaza and retire behind the left flank, which then becomes the rear of the army. And the other veliti, who should be placed in the rear according to the original arrangement, in this case should not be changed, as that place should not remain open, which from being the rear would become a flank. All the other things ought to be done as was said concerning the first front. What has been said concerning making a front from the right flank is intended also in making one from the left flank, since the same arrangements ought to be observed. If the enemy should happen to be large and organized to assault you on two sides, the two sides on which he assaults you ought to be strengthened from the two that are not assaulted, doubling the ranks in each one, and distributing the artillery, veleti, and cavalry among each side. If he comes from 3 or 4 sides, it needs must be either you or he lacks prudence. For if you were wise, you would never put yourself on the side where the enemy could assault you from 3 or 4 sides with large and organized forces. And if he wanted to attack you in safety, he must be so large and assault you on each side with a force almost as large as you have in your entire army. And if you are so little prudent that you put yourself in the midst of the territory and forces of an enemy who has 3 times the organized forces that you have, you cannot complain if evil happens to you, except of yourself. If it happens not by your fault, but by some misadventure, the injury will be without shame, and it will happen to you as it did to the Scipios in Spain and the Hasdrubal in Italy. But if the enemy has a much larger force than you, and in order to disorganize you wants to assault you on several sides, it will be his foolishness and his gamble. For to do this he must spread himself thin, and you can always attack on one side and resist on another, and in a brief time ruin him. This method of organizing an army, which is not seen but who is feared, is necessary, and it is a most useful thing to accustom your soldiers to assemble and march in such order, and in marching arrange themselves to fight according to the first front planned, and then return to marching formation. From that make a front from the rear, and then from the flank, and from that return to the original formation. These exercises and accustomization are necessary matters if you want a disciplined and trained army. Captains and princes have to work hard at these things, nor is military discipline anything else than to know how to command and how to execute these things. Nor is a disciplined army anything else than an army which is well trained in these arrangements. Nor would it be possible for anyone in these times who should well employ such discipline ever to be routed. And if this square formation which I have described is somewhat difficult, such difficulty is necessary if you take it up as an exercise, since, knowing how to organize and maintain oneself well in this, one would afterwards know how to manage more easily those which will not be as difficult. End of Book 5, Part 1.